Good afternoon and welcome to the LungLife AI investor presentation. Throughout this recorded presentation, investors will be in listen-only mode. Questions are encouraged and can be submitted at any time via the Q&A tab situated on the right-hand corner of your screen. Simply type in your questions and press send. The company may not be in a position to answer every question it receives during the meeting itself. However, the company can review all questions submitted today and publish responses where it is appropriate to do so. Before we begin, I'd like to submit the following poll. And now I'd like to hand you over to the management team from LungLife AI. Paul, David, good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon.
Thank you everyone for joining us today. I'm Paul Pagano, I'm the CEO of the company, and I'm joined by David Anderson, the company's Chief Financial Officer. And LungLife AI is a diagnostic company. We are focused on the early detection of lung cancer from a simple blood draw. We're happy to share our results with you today, the most exciting of which was the outcome of our highly anticipated clinical validation study of LungLB. We just announced that about 4 months ago. The first thing I'll do is I'll hand it over to David to cover the accounts, and then I'll take you through our progress to date, as well as our future directions. So with that.
Thank you, Paul.
You.
Good afternoon, everybody. So for the year ended December 23, our cash was just over 2.8 million. Our cash outflow from operations was just over 5 million, so an implied monthly burn of around 420,000. That was down from 490,000 in the prior year. So what's the money been spent on? The biggest item of expense is our wage bill. There was a slight increase in 2023, reflecting the fact that we had the full year impact of those that joined us in 2022. We had no hires in 2023, and we didn't lose anybody in 2023, but we did convert one of our part-time employees to a full-time employee. That increase was more than offset by a reduction in our R&D cost, arising from primarily the closure of enrollment. We managed to complete enrollment of our test in May, and also we didn't undertake this year any further work on our AI algorithm. The other thing to note in terms of the balance sheet is that we continue to carry at cost the license we have with Mount Sinai, and Paul will talk a bit more about that in terms of what's in that license later on. Moving forward then, in terms of recent events, so as many of you will perhaps know, we recently closed a fundraising of net 1.8 million. That, together with our opening cash position and the cost reductions that we have undertaken, gives us a cash runway through to April of 2025. Those cost reductions mainly in headcount and salary, because that is our largest cost. Those have been executed now, and that reduces our monthly burn on staff cost by half. So those, as I say, those actions have now been taken, and that gives us a runway through to April 25. Over to you, Paul. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, David. So for those of you that are familiar with the story, this will be a little bit of a refresh, but we are focused on lung cancer because it is the #1 cancer killer. It kills more women than breast cancer. In fact, more people than breast, colorectal, and prostate cancers combined. And the reason is that 80% of all lung cancers are diagnosed at late stage, and at that point, you're really just managing the end of life. However, if you can detect lung cancer early, it is curable. The way you detect it early is by CT scan. It's a 3-dimensional X-ray of the chest, and through what's called an indeterminate lung nodule, which is an abnormal growth in the lung that we'll cover a little more on the next slide. But suffice to say, evaluation is fraught with issues. It's very expensive. So while there is a screening program in the United States that uses CT scan for early detection, very few people actually use it. And as a result, most indeterminate lung nodules are caught by accident. So at LungLife, we are singularly focused on one aspect of early detection at this time, and that's the indeterminate lung nodule. Again, this is an abnormal growth that's picked up by CT scan. We've covered this pretty extensively in past presentations, so I'll just give a brief reminder that the tools available to doctors right now to evaluate these indeterminate lung nodules are inadequate. The wait and see pathway involves getting a follow-up CT scan in 3, 6, or 12 months, and it leads to long delays in potentially what could be a curative treatment. And then the other option is biopsy, which involves sticking a needle into the lung in order to get a piece of that nodule, but it's highly invasive and very dangerous. 20% of all lung nodule biopsies results in an adverse event, collapsed lung, things like bleeding. And 40% of all lung biopsies return a no lung cancer diagnosis. And so what you're left with is a current clinical care pathway to find out what that nodule is that's very dangerous for patients. And in addition to those dangers, there are also significant costs. Biopsy runs around $15,000 here in the US. And should it result in an adverse event that requires hospitalization, the costs jump to around $40,000. And these figures will come up again later in the presentation, but again, suffice to say, our LungLB test has been designed to solve these issues surrounding the dangers and the costs associated with biopsy. And as you can imagine, lung cancer being the #1 cancer killer, we have a significant opportunity in order to make an impact in early detection. We're starting off with indeterminate lung nodules. We'd like to establish a strong foothold here and then expand into other areas of early detection. Now, our main entry point specifically is going to be with small nodules. The vast majority of all nodules found today in the United States tend to be on the smaller side. We estimate around 70% of them will be within the size range that we validated in our study. And physicians have told us time and again that this is their greatest pain point. They're difficult to evaluate. Biopsy often yields inconclusive results. But importantly, those smaller nodules also represent the earliest stages of lung cancer when curative surgery is most possible. Now, this estimate of the market size is conservative. It doesn't include repeat testing. It doesn't include nodules that pop up after you receive curative intent surgery, which we know that both aspects are going to be areas that doctors will want to use the test in. We'll get to the full market in due course, but this represents our key area of focus for our initial resources going forward, and it's an area where we know there's a clear unmet need. So on to our test that's called LungLB. It's importantly positioned after the CT scan, after an indeterminate lung nodule has been found, and it all starts off with a simple blood draw. There's no processing at the clinical site, no ice packs are required, so it's very easy for physicians to adopt it. Importantly, the test requires no investment by hospital systems and no special training for physicians. This is important because we're not adding any additional barriers to adoption. What we're looking for specifically in the LungLB test is for circulating genetically abnormal cells, or CGACs, and we do this by a process called FISH. That's where you apply light signals to the DNA, and you can see those under the microscope. The important takeaway here is that these are two technologies that doctors are very comfortable with. On the back end, the test utilizes an AI-derived algorithm to help identify these cells more accurately, and this allows for significant efficiency gains and lower costs for the test. Once the test is performed, we can get it back to the physician within 5 to 7 days. And importantly, we keep that report simple again. It goes out as the patient either having a higher or lower risk of having lung cancer, up or down. There's nothing challenging for the doctor to interpret. All right, so our pilot validation study results were published in June of last year, and they demonstrated high positive predictive value in patients who had indeterminate lung nodules. And it really served as the basis for our validation study, which we recently, as of January, announced the results of. And there are a few features that we'd like to call to your attention before getting to those key numbers. First, the LungLB test performed best in patients with small lung nodules, and this is important for two big reasons. First, it represents the earliest stages of cancer when cure is most likely possible. The second is that there are no real viable options for doctors to use in terms of diagnostic tests. Nothing really has been designed to work well for small lung nodules. Our pulmonologist partners have echoed our enthusiasm for these smaller lung nodules. They've reiterated that they're unlikely to be swayed by any diagnostic test for larger lung nodules, right? They know what to do there, but it's the smaller ones they need help with. And it's where our test performs well, and it's where we'll have our initial focus. The second thing that I'd like to bring to your attention is that the majority of patients enrolled in the study were of what's called intermediate risk. This is as opposed to high or low risk. The important part here is that doctors know what to do with high and low risk. It's the intermediate risk that represents the most diagnostically challenged nodules, and it means that we ran a very rigorous study. And I will tell you that has not gone unnoticed by our pulmonologist colleagues. So on to the numbers. We've highlighted from day one that positive predictive value is the crucial metric. As a reminder, this helped doctors predict whether an unknown nodule that they see in clinic is going to be cancerous. And so we were very pleased with a positive predictive value of 81%. You compare that to a current clinical care pathway that yields about 60% PPV. Reminder, 40% of all biopsies return a no lung cancer diagnosis. And to put this into context, we have this schematic at the bottom of the slide. Right now, if a doctor sends somebody off to get a biopsy, it's because they believe they're going to be positive for lung cancer. And it's cancer 60% of the time. Remember, 40% of biopsies are not cancer. That means you have a 60% PPV. We saw this same exact phenomenon in our study. Around 57% of the patients who got that biopsy for the lung nodule ended up having cancer. Again, that gives us confidence that we enrolled the right patient group. So with current clinical practice, out of 100 people on the left-hand side here, 40 of them are going to have an unnecessary biopsy. 8 of those people are going to end up having an adverse event, collapsed lung, bleeding, something else, as a result of that unnecessary biopsy. And as a reminder, that costs around $40,000. Now, in a scenario where LungLB is used, that number could very well be cut in half, right? We operate at an 80% positive predictive value. So when we have 100 people that we believe are positive, the test gets it right 80% of the time, right? So 20% gets moved to the right side of the equation. The value proposition here for LungLB is very clear, right? We're reducing costs to insurance companies for those unnecessary and invasive biopsies, but most importantly, we're having better outcomes for patients. As you may recall, David and I haven't been waiting around for our study results to come in. Since day one, we've been running parallel processes that have served to build the foundation for commercialization so that once we did get those positive test results, we were ready to start selling the test and recognizing revenue. Now, LungLife's clinical laboratory is CLIA certified, we're CAP accredited, and we have approval for the LungLB test from the New York State Department of Health. This allows us to market the test to greater than 90% of the US population as an LDT, or a laboratory developed test. We've also highlighted from the beginning that FDA is optional, but it's something that we believe is beneficial. And that's why we took the extra effort to run our study in accordance with FDA guidelines. We also believe that this is going to help with adoption because doctors understand the rigorous design that goes into an FDA validation study. Now, if you recall, the plan was to submit to the FDA soon after our study was complete, but launch it as an LDT first while we wait for approval from the agency, which could come 12 to 18 months later. So our plan is to still launch the test as an LDT first, but because of the agency's recent announcement of their intention to regulate LDTs, we've been advised to put our application on hold until further guidance comes out to the FDA, which we expect later this year. Because depending on what that guidance says, it may actually result in a simpler, more cost-effective and time-efficient pathway for us to get that check mark from the FDA. Because again, we're already ahead of the curve with how we've run our study. Now, the second part of commercialization is with reimbursement. As a reminder, this is how you get paid for your test. And there are 3 important parts. We've laid the groundwork with our PLA code that was granted in January by the American Medical Association. And additionally, our national Medicare price of $2,030 per test. The last piece of this puzzle is with coverage. And as with all things reimbursement, this is going to require a methodical approach. Showing clinical utility is going to be important, which is why we plan to start gathering that utility evidence in our early access program. And we'll talk about that in the next couple of slides. This will be important for both commercial payers as well as our largest public payer, Medicare, which again, we'll discuss a little bit later. But importantly, I don't want you to think that we can't get revenue before Medicare offers a coverage determination, right? Just like we're not waiting for the FDA to launch the test as an LDT, we don't have to wait for the Medicare coverage determination in order to start billing payers, and we won't. That's what we're going to be doing with our revenue cycle management and market access roles here in the United States, and we talk about that on this next slide. So on this slide, we talk about the components that are important for commercial success. Many of them we've done already. We have more to do to promote this commercial proof of concept. But importantly here, we're not trying to get in front of our skis, right? We understand that introducing a new technology in the healthcare setting takes a methodical approach, just like what we've been doing since day one. Really what we're trying to show here now is that LungLB will be adopted, right? We have clinical opinion from our pulmonologists that this test will be useful, but now we have to turn that opinion into clinical fact. So driving the adoption curve is going to be a key part of this commercial proof of concept. We understand that adoption isn't just about the data, right? That's important. 80% PPV gets us there. But a big component of it is also about trust. The fact that we validated LungLB in one of the hardest areas helps with that trust, right? This has not gone unnoticed by doctors that the majority of our patients were in that intermediate risk category. Another good thing for us is that when you have nothing else that really works for small lung nodules, trying out a new product is less risky, so you're willing to give it a go. Now, in order to drive that adoption, we need to do some small proof of concepts. We're going to be doing this with our early access program. From that, we're going to get some case studies and show that LungLB is useful in areas where doctors have limited options. And that's where the trust equation is going to be easiest to solve. This is how you publish, how you build up your key opinion leaders. And then the idea is that they go out into the community and talk about the test with their peers. And that again serves to build adoption. As we mentioned before, we don't have to wait for Medicare's coverage determination in order to bill insurance companies. Now, a local coverage determination, or LCD, makes that process easier to get paid, and that's why we're working towards it. But otherwise, it's the usual period of giving revenue through what's called the appeals process. Now, to facilitate this, we've already brought in revenue cycle management and market access roles. Not only will these roles help us win contracts with payers, but they're also going to help us with denials. This is when insurance companies don't want to pay for your test. And as we've said before, in the early days, we expect denials. But over time, and with increased test utilization, we expect the number of denials to decrease. This is the reason why adoption is so important, right? Doctors will adopt it because it's useful, and that's why payers end up cutting you a check. So onto the early access program, or your EAP. This is essentially your soft commercial launch. And here we're going to be looking for two things. First, it's where we find any logistical hiccups with the process, things that could set back your commercial path that really have nothing to do with the test. This is the same reason why software companies will do a beta release first before releasing a new version of software, to get any of those unforeseen kinks out of the way. The key for LungLife is doing this in a limited scope, low-cost setting. And what that means is keep it small and do it with friendly sites from your validation study. Now, the second important part about the early access program is it's where we expect to see clinical utility data. Because during the program, we're going to be asking doctors if the LungLB test results helped with their decision-making process. Did it change the care pathway? This is very important to understanding the adoption curve, and likewise, it's going to support our case for getting reimbursement for the test. Now, we have 7 sites that are interested in participating. We'd like to get 3 more. This way, we're not spread too thin. By just keeping it at 10 sites in the early days, we're able to give doctors the white glove service, right? I, as the CEO, will likely be on the phone helping doctors with the test results. But once we have this, once we have the data and we can publish on it, we have the utility, the interesting case studies, we'll know about the adoption curve. And we'll have done all of this before having a big sales and marketing budget. So phase 1 is all about proving adoption, the early access program through our early adopter network, turning that clinical opinion into fact where usefulness is compelling, right? So compelling that during the appeals process with insurance companies, where they may try to deny us coverage, we actually expect to get a good reception because there's nothing else the doctor can use in this setting. Again, this is why small nodules make such an excellent entry point for us. So again, by showing adoption, we show that the test is useful, and this is what payers are looking for. And in the United States, there are two types of payers. There's commercial private insurance plans, and then there's Medicare being our largest public insurer. And you typically get things started with Medicare. Now, the good thing for LungLife is we're in a Medicare jurisdiction that uses the MolDX evaluation program. The important takeaway here is that they have a very clearly defined pathway in order to evaluate your test and assign coverage. And what we'd like to talk about here on this slide is how you streamline that coverage process for Medicare. And I will say that generally they want to do this same thing too, right? They want to move more towards broad coverage. What I mean by this is they don't want to spend months assessing a test and assigning coverage, only to turn around and have to do the same exact thing for another test for the same indication. They just want to come out and say one time, this area is generally useful to cover. And this is where a very interesting catalyst comes into play for LungLife. Because in August of last year, what's called a foundational local coverage determination was proposed by MolDX. And this was specifically for tests that cover lung nodules. Now, a foundational LCD covers a broad indication. So in this case, it will be any molecular test for indeterminate lung nodules will be covered. This is important for LungLife because it cuts a traditionally 18 to 24 month time process into one in which a new test can be covered in as little as 8 to 12 months. So last year, we were invited to present to Medicare's MolDX team late in the year and provide our recommendations on what would make a stronger foundational LCD. And we believe that that foundational LCD will be finalized later this year, and we plan on updating the market in due course with that. So onto our timelines. Our first phase is focused on proving adoption through our commercial proof of concept. We're kicking off our early access program, that commercial soft launch now. We'll be giving the sites 1 to 2 months in order to get those samples ordered, so that by the end of that period, we will have an understanding of utility and any case studies that arise during that program. And that utility, again, tees us up for strong reimbursement. Now, our plan is to have a meeting with MolDX, after of which we'll be looking to submit our what's called our clinical dossier, or a packet of documents for technical assessment later in Q4 of this year. We expect the foundational LCD to be finalized this year, so we could have coverage in as little as 12 months after that. Now, if it's not finalized exactly to our liking, we would like to submit a little bit of extra data from that early access program and those utility case studies in order to broaden the revenue potential. And so we could be looking at extending coverage in mid-2026. That's where those dotted lines to come in for. Either way, we have clear line of sight to more mature revenues through that foundational LCD. We'd like to have a couple of publications on LungLB by the end of this year, of course, with the validation, the analytical and the clinical validation studies. These are going to help support not only adoption of the test, because it gets the word out there to physicians, but it also helps support the reimbursement case. Now, we've put in the first nominal revenues here, again, before Medicare's LCD comes into play, because again, we don't need that LCD in order to start billing payers, right? We can do that shortly after the EAP is complete. Now, the way that we accelerate those revenues is going to be through partnerships. And that's what we want to talk about in this next slide. So the way this begins for LungLife is small, and it's internal to the company in 2024. That's with our early access program and our soft launch. And what we get out of that is a number of things. We get trust. We get key opinion leaders. We'll be getting patient case studies that we can do presentations on at conferences where the LungLB test is compelling to use. Any samples ordered after the EAP allows us to establish some of those nominal revenues. But again, once we've proven it, that's where collaboration and the expanded launch can come into play. Now, David and I have understood since day one that it's not always advisable to build a large sales and marketing team for a single product. So what you do to accelerate revenue is to partner with someone who already has these functions, but lack a test for early lung cancer detection. And fortunately for us, we believe there are a lot of options here because detecting lung cancer earlier has proven difficult for a lot of people. One company, for example, has demonstrated 1% sensitivity in stage 1 lung cancer, right? The number one cancer killer. And stage 1 is where we do best, right? Remember, we excel with small lung nodules. And it's a relatively small community of diagnostic developers, and we generally talk with everyone, and we continue to do so. Some of these strategic partners are going to want to see that this can be done before they apply their sales and distribution resources. That's why the early access program is important. This de-risks it for them. But we know this is something that they're going to want because we believe we have the best solution for early lung cancer detection, and it's going to fill a critical gap for a lot of people. So before we summarize, I'd just like to take a moment and remind the listeners of what we built at LungLife that might not be readily visible to people. First, because the LungLB test only uses 2 milliliters of blood and it doesn't use plasma at all, remember we focus on cells. Over the past few years, we've been building a biorepository that now has greater than 600 patient specimens representing early stage lung cancer and benign lung nodules. Many of these samples, including every single one from our recently reported study, have matched CT scan data. This puts LungLife in a very unique position to leverage information that we have in both the blood and in the images from CT scan. And in addition to those incoming samples that we have from the Early Detection Research Network, again, as a reminder, this is in partnership with UCLA and Boston University, we expect to have another 500 samples coming in from indeterminate lung nodules. We also, of course, have our fully paid license to access de-identified patient records from Mount Sinai as it relates to lung cancer and those at risk for lung cancer. And importantly, this includes CT scan and PET scan images. This is an incredibly valuable source of data that we believe will help us make progress with a lot of those strategic partners. All right. So to reiterate, we have a test that works, and it works in the number one cancer killer, and in an area where there are no real viable options, but with the greatest benefit to patients, right? Small lung nodules. Now we need to get clinicians using it, and we need to get them talking about it. We have the initial steps for regulatory and reimbursement support in place. Now we need to prove adoption, and we have a clear path to do so. During this process, we expect initial revenues from LungLB, and with the completion of this soft commercial launch, we will have de-risked adoption and laid the groundwork for more mature revenues by seeking coverage under that foundational LCD that we expect to see later this year. And importantly, David and I are spending this period pursuing all strategic opportunities that will accelerate getting the LungLB test into the hands of patients, because we believe that anything that does that is a good thing to do. So that concludes our update. We would like to thank you for your time and attention, and we're happy to take any questions.
Paul, David, thank you very much for your presentation this afternoon. Ladies and gentlemen, please do continue to submit your questions just by using the Q&A tab situated on the top right-hand corner of your screen. Just while the company take a few moments to review those questions submitted today, I'd like to remind you that a recording of this presentation, along with a copy of the slides and the published Q&A, can be accessed via your investor dashboard. Paul, David, as you can see, we have received a number of questions throughout today's presentation. Can I please ask you to read out the questions and give responses where appropriate to do so, and I'll pick up from you at the end.
Yeah, thank you for that. So the first question we have, are you in discussions with other companies about selling LungLB into other countries? The technology is amazing, but others are producing tests of their own, and the first to market is critical to success, in my opinion. Yeah, that's an excellent question. I mean, we would never want to ourselves go into other countries and try and sell the technology. Partnering with someone would be important. One of the things that David and I will be looking at in these strategic partnerships is their global reach, right? Is there a way they can get this into other countries outside of the United States? Because we know lung cancer isn't just a problem here, but really it's the worldwide number one cancer killer. So yes, we are in discussions with strategics. Generally, we talk with everybody. Again, the diagnostics community is small. The lung cancer diagnostics community, everybody knows everybody else. So yeah, that's going to be important for us. How is the FDA application process going? So we have everything we need in order to submit to the FDA. We've been holding off on submission because of their recent announcement to start regulating LDTs. We're not exactly sure how they intend on doing that because 80% of all diagnostics in the US are offered as LDTs. So what we've been advised to do is to hold off until the FDA produces guidance documents for test developers like ourselves, so we can understand how we navigate that process. And the reason that I mentioned earlier it may result in a simpler process for us is because some people have provided public comments to the FDA on how they should regulate. For example, they say, look, if a test developer has New York State approval, being the most rigorous state to get regulatory clearance from, perhaps that should suffice for FDA clearance. In fact, FDA has already made New York State a third-party reviewer for a specific type of FDA application called a 510K, basically where you're comparing two tests with one another. So they already have a remit to be able to approve tests the same way the FDA was. This would potentially expand the remit, but we don't know if that is going to go into the final guidance documents. So our plan is to wait until those comes out and then see what the best path is for LungLife in order to get that check mark from the FDA. All right. Was the 81% validation lower than the 89%, which had been the target, I thought? Okay, so this is an excellent question, and I'll try not to get too scientific on it. So in the original pilot validation study, we had reported 89% positive predictive value, which was very strong. What you expect between one validation to the next validation study is your numbers to drop a little bit. This is because you train on your first study, and because you know the outcome of those patients, it's easier to get a higher positive predictive value. When you go into your secondary or test set, you expect the results to drop a little bit because the results of the biopsy, I should say, are fully blinded. Another important thing with positive predictive value is it's related to the prevalence of the cancer in the data set. So our first data set, the prevalence of cancer was around 75%. And so getting 89% was a good thing. It was quite a bit higher than the prevalence. In this FDA validation study, the prevalence was around 57%. So we had a much lower prevalence than before. It's much harder to get a higher positive predictive value. That's the main reason we were so excited about 81% PPV, because it was much harder to get above 80, having your prevalence start closer to 57%. Okay, the next question is, how will the funds raised from the recent share issuance specifically contribute to commercial proof of concept and broader adoption of the LungLB test? Yeah, this is an excellent question. So with the early access program, we're going to be providing these tests after physicians order them, but we won't be billing insurance on it. So we're going to be eating the costs of those tests, and that's what some of this money from the fundraise is going to be going towards. Now, importantly, the feedback that we get from those patients, from those doctors, the data about clinical utility and the case studies are going to be much more valuable. So we consider that an investment into the company's effectively what's a sales and marketing budget, right? Because we're going to be publishing on those case studies, publishing those and presenting them at academic conferences and in the literature. That's going to help drive awareness of the test. We believe it will also help drive adoption of the test. So it's a very smart investment and limited investment in a sales and marketing budget. Additionally, we are interviewing currently sell-side brokers for the company to help look at all strategic opportunities with partners. So that's an additional area where the funds from the proceeds will be going towards. We want to run a proper process to make sure that we leave no stone unturned. Okay. What revenue are you budgeting in for FY 2024? I'll touch on this briefly and maybe hand it over to David for a little bit more color. The most important part for us right now is this commercial proof of concept, right? Understanding what that adoption curve looks like. So we've put in the budget nominal revenues. And the most important thing for us is getting that data from the early access program, publishing on that, getting that more mature source of revenue from Medicare, which will be supported by what comes out of the early access program. And the path to get to more mature revenues, again, is going to come once we have that strategic alliance with a commercial partner, right? That's where they can apply their existing sales and marketing effort to our, what we believe to be a best-in-class test to provide a world-class offering for patients with indeterminate lung nodules. David, do you want to add a little bit more color?
Yeah, I'd only say that the Investec note is suggesting 100,000 for next year, dollars.
Great. The last question that I'll touch on, you showed PPV. Do you happen to have the negative predictive value? And the answer is yes, we do have the negative predictive value. It was stronger than we expected, but I don't want to highlight NPV because it's not the area where doctors have that unmet need, right? They have an unknown nodule in clinic, and they need to know whether or not they need to accelerate treatment diagnosis. Right now, physician PPV operates at around 60%, right? 40% of all lung nodule biopsies returns a no lung cancer diagnosis. So they get it right 60% of the time. Their negative predictive value operates around 95%, right? So they're very good at looking at a nodule, and if they believe it's not cancer, that they shouldn't go off and do a biopsy, they're actually pretty good at that. So developing a test in that area that has a high negative predictive value isn't necessarily clinically useful, right? Even if you can get a test that has 98% negative predictive value, physician ability right now operates at around 95%. It's positive predictive value that only operates at around 60% in the clinical care pathway today that they need help with. And that's why offering a test that has upwards of 80% PPV could help change the diagnostic paradigm.
Paul, David, thank you for answering all those questions you can from investors. And of course, the company can review all questions submitted today and will publish those responses on the Investor Meet Company platform. Just before redirecting investors to provide you with their feedback, which I know is particularly important to the company, Paul, could I please just ask you for a few closing comments?
Yeah, we'll just say that we're proud of the team's work against our main milestone that we set out at our initial AIM listing, which was to validate the LungLB test and make sure that we had key reimbursement and regulatory marks in place so that once the results were in, we were commercial ready, right? And we've done exactly that. We have a test that works extraordinarily well in the #1 cancer killer, and it works in an area where there are no real viable options for physicians, right? And where lung cancer is most likely to be cured, the small lung nodules. We've been working on this test for quite some time, and it's really exciting to be driving this transition from what's effectively a development company into a clinical commercial stage company, and where patients will start benefiting from our efforts. So thank you again for your time and attention, and we look forward to updating you in the future.
Paul, David, thank you for updating investors today. Can I please ask investors not to close this session, as you'll now be automatically redirected to provide your feedback in order that the management team can better understand your views and expectations. This will only take a few moments to complete and I'm sure will be greatly valued by the company. On behalf of the management team of LungLife AI, we'd like to thank you for attending today's presentation and good afternoon to you all.
Thank you.
Thank you.